The iron ring around Meredith Owens's throat had been there so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to swallow without the weight of it. But when the auctioneer grabbed her by the chain attached to it and dragged her onto the platform in Nevada City, California, she knew this September day in 1872 would be different because the men bidding weren't looking at her like property anymore, but like something more dangerous. She kept her eyes down just as they'd taught her, her hands folded precisely in front of her apron, her breathing shallow and controlled. The saloon owner who'd purchased her 3 years ago had trained every natural impulse out of her until she moved like a clockwork doll, responding to commands without thought, eating only when permitted, speaking only when spoken to, existing in a state of perpetual compliance that had kept her alive but hollowed out everything that made her human. The bidding started at $50. Meredith didn't flinch when rough hands grabbed her jaw to display her teeth, didn't react when someone yanked her braid to check the length of her hair. She'd learned that reactions earned punishments, that the safest path was to become nothing, feel nothing, want nothing. The men who'd kept her had methods for breaking spirits that would have made hardened outlaws weep, and they'd applied those methods with the systematic precision of ranchers training a wild mustang. Beatings for hesitation, isolation for defiance, starvation for the smallest spark of rebellion. By the time they'd finished with her, she'd have crawled on broken glass if they'd commanded it, would have walked into a fire if they'd pointed her toward the flames. $75 on it, called a voice from the back of the crowd, and something in its timbre made Meredith's carefully controlled mask slip for just a fraction of a second. She caught herself immediately, her face smoothing back into blank obedience, but she'd heard the difference in that voice. It didn't carry the cruel anticipation of the other bidders, didn't have that edge of hunger that meant pain would follow. It sounded almost sad. 100, countered the man beside the platform, a cattle baron named Morrison who owned half the grazing land between here and Sacramento. Meredith had served him drinks before, had endured his wandering hands with the same empty acceptance she endured everything. She knew what winning her would mean for him, knew the specific degradations he preferred, and some small part of her that still existed deep beneath the layers of trained obedience curled up tight and wished for death. 200. The voice from the back again, clearer now, and the crowd parted enough for Meredith to see him without lifting her head too obviously. He was tall, built like someone who'd spent his life working cattle, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were the color of creek water in summer, green-brown and clear, and when they met hers for that brief moment, they held none of the assessment she was used to. He looked at her like she was a person he was trying to save, not property he wanted to own. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with greed. 200 from the gentleman in back. Do I hear 250? Morrison scowled, clearly not expecting competition. 250, he growled, shooting a challenging look at the stranger, and that's as high as I go for damaged goods. Meredith felt the words hit her like physical blows, but kept her expression empty. Damaged goods. Yes, that's what she was. They'd made sure of it, had broken and reshaped her until the girl she'd been before was just a ghost haunting the shell they'd created. 300, the stranger said quietly, and there was steel underneath the sadness now. And she's not damaged. She's surviving. The crowd murmured at that, at both the astronomical sum and the strange comment. $300 could buy a good horse and tack, could stock a ranch for a season, could set a man up in business. For a saloon girl who'd been used hard and trained into submission, it was madness. Morrison laughed, ugly and short. You're welcome to her, fool. Probably won't last another year anyway. He turned and pushed his way through the crowd, done with the whole affair. The auctioneer looked around hopefully for any other bidders, but the crowd was already dispersing, the entertainment over. Sold to Cole Keller for $300. Pay the clerk and collect your purchase. Cole? His name was Cole. Meredith filed it away in the small space in her mind where she still kept information, still processed the world beyond immediate commands. She watched his boots approach, good leather worn soft with use, and waited for him to grab the chain. That's what they did. They established control immediately, made sure she understood who held her leash. Instead, he crouched down in front of her, putting himself at eye level. "My name's Cole Keller," he said gently, as if she might actually care. "I have a ranch about 5 miles north of here. I'm going to take you there, and I'm going to need some help around the place, but I'm not going to hurt you. Do you understand?" Meredith kept her eyes down and nodded once, precisely. It was the response they'd taught her. Agreement without personality, compliance without connection. She heard him sigh, soft and sad, before he stood. "Let me handle the paperwork, and then we'll go. Are you hungry? Thirsty?" The questions confused her. No one asked what she needed. They told her when to eat, when to drink, when to breathe if they felt like it. She didn't know how to answer, so she stayed silent, still as stone. Cole seemed to understand. "All right, we'll sort it out. Just stay here for a minute." She stayed because she'd been told to stay, because that's what she did. She stayed while he went into the building to pay, stayed while the crowd finished scattering, stayed even when a drunk stumbled too close and said something crude about her appearance. She'd learned not to hear words like that, not to let them penetrate whatever was left of her. When Cole returned, he had papers in one hand and a canteen in the other. He held out the canteen to her. "Drink," he said, and it was an order, so she took it and drank. Careful, measured sips like they'd taught her. Not too much at once. Never be greedy. Never take more than offered. He watched her with those river-colored eyes, something complicated moving through his expression. When she'd finished 4 precisely counted sips, she held the canteen back out to him. He took it, but his jaw was tight. "You can drink more if you want." Want? What a strange word. She didn't want things anymore. Wanting led to disappointment, and disappointment led to punishment. She shook her head in that tiny economical gesture that meant no without causing offense. "All right?" He reached toward the chain attached to her collar, and every muscle in her body tensed for what usually came next. The yank, the pull, the reminder that she was livestock. Instead, his fingers worked at the clasp, and after a moment of fumbling, the chain fell away. He coiled it up and tossed it into the mud beside the platform with clear disgust. "Won't need that." Meredith's hand flew to her throat, touching the collar that still remained. They always left the collar. It was the visible sign of what she was, the mark that told everyone she was property. But the chain was gone, and she didn't know what that meant, didn't know how to walk without it. Cole must have seen her confusion. "I've got a wagon just down the street. Stay close to me and we'll get you home." He paused, then added carefully, "I mean my home, the ranch. You'll have your own room." Her own room. The words didn't make sense. She slept on a pallet in the storeroom at the saloon, slept wherever they told her to sleep. Rooms were for people, not for things like her. She followed him because that's what she'd been trained to do, her steps measured and precise, maintaining exactly the right distance behind him. Not too close, which would be presumptuous, not too far, which would be disobedient. The perfect heel that they'd beaten into her over months of correction. Cole glanced back at her and his mouth tightened, but he didn't comment. They reached a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 draft horses, and he held out his hand to help her up. She stared at the hand, confused again. She was supposed to climb up herself, was supposed to manage without assistance because help implied she mattered. But he was offering, and she didn't know which rule to follow, didn't know which choice would bring punishment. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'm just trying to help." She put her hand in his because he was waiting, and his palm was warm and calloused and gentle when he steadied her into the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her, gathered the reins, and clicked to the horses. They moved forward smoothly, pulling away from Nevada City's dusty main street toward the brown hills beyond. The September sun was hot on Meredith's head, but she sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight. The wagon seat was wide enough that she didn't have to touch Cole, and she was grateful for that small mercy. Touch usually led to expectations, and expectations led to uses she'd learned to endure but never accept. "I bought the ranch 2 years ago," Cole said after a while, his voice casual like he was talking to a friend instead of purchased property. "It's not much yet, but the land's good and the water rights are solid. I've got about 200 head of cattle, some chickens, a milk cow. Been doing all the work myself, but it's getting to be too much for one person. I could use help with the cooking and the household stuff. Maybe the garden if you know anything about that." Meredith listened because she'd been trained to listen, to absorb information that might help her anticipate needs and avoid mistakes. She knew how to cook basic meals, how to clean, how to mend clothes and tend fires and do laundry. They'd made sure she had skills that justified keeping her, skills that made her useful beyond the obvious. "I know you probably don't trust me," Cole continued, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "I know you've got no reason to. But I want you to understand something from the start. I bought you to get you away from those bastards, not to continue what they were doing. You'll work for your keep, same as any ranch hand, but you'll be paid and fed and treated decent. And the first chance we get, we're getting that collar off your neck. Paid." The word rattled around in her head like a marble in an empty jar. She'd never been paid. She'd been given scraps of food, cast-off clothes, a corner to sleep in, but never money. Money implied choice, implied freedom, implied personhood. It had to be a lie. They all lied at first, said sweet things to lower her guard before showing their true nature. She'd learned to wait for the truth, to watch for the moment the kindness cracked and revealed the cruelty underneath. The ranch appeared as they crested a low hill. A simple wooden house with a covered porch, a large barn, several outbuildings and fenced pastures stretching toward distant tree lines. It was isolated, Meredith noted. The nearest neighbor was probably miles away. No one would hear anything that happened here. The familiar cold numbness settled over her as she prepared herself for whatever was coming. Cole pulled the wagon up near the house and set the brake. He climbed down and came around to her side, offering his hand again. This time, she took it without hesitation because she was learning his patterns, adapting to his expectations. That's what she did. She became whatever shape fit the mold they pressed her into. "Let me show you around," he said, and started toward the house. Meredith followed, cataloging details automatically. The porch was swept clean. Firewood was stacked neatly beside the door. Through the windows, she could see simple furniture, nothing fancy but well-maintained. This was a working ranch, not a showplace. That told her something about Cole, though she wasn't sure what yet. Inside, the house was dim and cool after the bright heat outside. The main room held a large stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 4 chairs, some shelves lined with books and supplies. There was a small kitchen area with a cast iron stove, a counter for food preparation, hooks for pots and pans. Everything was clean but clearly managed by someone who was too busy to fuss over details. "Kitchen's here, as you can see," Cole said, gesturing around. "I've been making do with simple food, but I won't complain if you can manage better. There's a pantry through that door, root cellar access outside. I keep chickens, so there's always eggs. I butcher a steer every few months for meat." He moved toward a narrow hallway. 2 bedrooms back here. Mine's this one. This one's yours." He pushed open a door to reveal a small room with a real bed, a dresser, a washstand with a basin and pitcher. The window had actual glass and looked out over the eastern pasture. The bed had sheets and a quilt, pillows that looked soft. It was nicer than anywhere Meredith had slept in 3 years. "I know it's not fancy," Cole said, misreading her silence, "but it's private and the roof doesn't leak. There's extra blankets in the chest if you get cold at night." He pulled something from his pocket, a heavy iron key, and held it out to her. "This locks the door from the inside. I've got no other copy. When you're in here, you're safe. I won't ever come in without permission. You have my word." Meredith stared at the key like it was a snake. This had to be a test. They did that sometimes, offered false choices to see if she'd take liberties, so they'd have an excuse for correction. She didn't reach for it. Cole waited, then slowly set the key on the dresser. It's there when you want it, no pressure. He backed toward the door, giving her space. Why don't you settle in for a bit? There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up. I need to tend the horses and check on the cattle. I'll be back in an hour or so, and maybe you could start something for supper if you're up to it. Supplies are in the pantry. Make whatever you think is good. Make whatever she thought was good. Another impossible choice. She didn't think things were good or bad. She followed instructions. She needed him to tell her exactly what to make, how to make it, what time to have it ready. Otherwise, how would she know if she'd done it right? How would she avoid punishment? But Cole was already leaving, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and then she heard the front door close. She was alone. Alone in a room with a bed and a window and a key. Alone in a silence that wasn't filled with crude laughter or breaking glass or the sounds of violence. Just alone. Meredith stood frozen in the middle of the small room for a long time, waiting for the next instruction, the next command. When none came, when the silence continued unbroken except for the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the eaves, something small and fragile stirred in her chest. It might have been fear. It might have been hope. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. Eventually, she moved to the washstand and poured water into the basin. Her hands shook slightly as she splashed her face, washed the dust from her skin. There was a small mirror above the stand, and she caught sight of herself for the first time in months. They hadn't allowed mirrors. Vanity was punished. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. 21 years old but looking older, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under gray eyes that had once been bright with life. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe braid, limp and dull. The iron collar around her neck was a thick band of dark metal, locked at the back, with a mechanism she couldn't see or reach. She'd worn it so long there was a permanent line of calluses where it rubbed against her skin. She looked away quickly. That brief moment of self-awareness already too much. She dried her face and hands on the clean towel beside the basin, folded it precisely back into place, and went to investigate the pantry. The supplies were basic but plentiful. Flour, cornmeal, beans, rice, salt pork, some dried beef, onions, potatoes, canned tomatoes, dried herbs, enough to make a decent stew, which seemed safest. Stew was forgiving, hard to ruin, and would feed multiple meals. She gathered what she needed and started working, her movements efficient and practiced. This she knew how to do. This had clear steps and measurable outcomes. This wouldn't earn punishment as long as she followed the rules. She had a pot simmering on the stove when Cole returned, his boots loud on the porch steps before the door opened. Meredith immediately moved to a neutral position by the counter, her hands folded, her eyes down, waiting to be told if she'd done right or wrong. Cole came in smelling like horses and sun-warmed leather. He glanced at the stove, at the pot sending up fragrant steam, and something in his expression softened. That smells really good. Thank you. He moved to the water bucket by the door and washed his hands in the basin there, then dried them on his pants with unself-conscious ease. It'll be ready to eat soon? Meredith nodded once, still not speaking. They'd taught her that silence was safer than words, that words could be twisted and used against you. All right, I'll just set the table then. He moved around the kitchen with comfortable familiarity, pulling out plates and utensils, setting them at 2 places at the table, 2 places, one for him, one for her. Like they were going to eat together, like she was allowed to sit at the table instead of waiting to eat whatever scraps remained after he finished. When the stew was ready, she ladled it into bowls and brought them to the table, then stood by the counter waiting for permission. Cole had already sat down, and he looked up at her with those river-colored eyes that seemed to see too much. You can sit, he said gently. You made the food. You should eat it while it's hot. Another test. Had to be, but he was watching her, waiting, and she'd learned that hesitation was its own form of disobedience. She moved to the chair and sat on its very edge, her back straight, her hands in her lap. The food was right in front of her, but she didn't reach for it. Cole picked up his spoon and took a bite, made an appreciative sound. "This is really good. You're a fine cook." He took another bite, then seemed to realize she still hadn't moved. He set his spoon down. "Meredith, that's your name, right?" It was on the papers. She nodded fractionally. "Meredith, you're allowed to eat. You don't need to wait for permission. This is your food as much as mine." Her food, as much as his. The concepts weren't computing. She stared at the bowl, at the chunks of potato and carrot and meat in rich brown gravy, and her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, just a crust of bread and some weak coffee. But taking food without being explicitly commanded felt dangerous, felt like the kind of liberty that earned correction. "Please eat," Cole said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice now. "I can see you're hungry. I can see you're scared. But I promise you on my life, you're allowed to eat at my table. You're allowed to take care of yourself." The please did it. That was a command she understood, softened with courtesy, but still a command. She picked up her spoon with shaking hands and took a small bite. The food was hot and savory and good, better than anything she'd tasted in years because the places that bought her didn't waste good food on property. She took another bite, fighting to keep her pace measured and controlled. They taught her to eat slowly, never show hunger, never display need. Cole went back to his own meal, and they ate in silence, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. When she'd finished, Meredith immediately stood and reached for his bowl, ready to clean up. That was the pattern. Serve, wait. Clean. Stay useful. "Hey, no." Cole put his hand up, not touching her, but blocking her motion. "You cooked. I'll clean. That's fair." Fair? Another strange word in this strange place. She stood uncertainly, not knowing where to go or what to do if she wasn't working. Idle hands invited trouble. Idle time meant they'd find uses for her that she'd rather avoid. Cole seemed to sense her confusion. "Why don't you go sit on the porch? It's nice in the evenings, cool air coming down from the hills. I'll finish up here and join you in a bit." The porch. Outside where she could breathe space that wasn't thick with expectations. She moved toward the door slowly, half expecting him to call her back, but he just started gathering dishes with easy competence. She stepped outside into the golden late afternoon light and stood at the porch railing looking out over the ranch that was apparently her new prison. Except it didn't feel like a prison. The land rolled away in every direction, brown grass rippling in the breeze like waves on an ocean. The sky was huge and blue, streaked with the first hints of evening color. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing peacefully, could hear the faint sounds of chickens settling for the night. It was beautiful, in a stark, simple way that made something deep in her chest ache with a feeling she couldn't name. She heard the door open behind her, heard Cole's footsteps cross the porch. He leaned against the railing a few feet away, respecting her space, and looked out at the same view. "It gets in your blood," he said quietly. "This land. When I first came west from Missouri, I thought I was just passing through. But then I saw country like this, and I knew I'd never want to be anywhere else." Meredith didn't respond. She didn't know how to make conversation, didn't know what he wanted from her in this moment. Small talk wasn't something they'd trained her for. They'd trained her for service and submission, not companionship. "I know this is all real strange for you," Cole continued, his voice low and careful. "I know you probably think I'm lying about everything, that the other shoe's going to drop any minute, and I understand that. I do. But I want you to know why I bought you today." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. 5 years ago, I had a sister, Sarah. She was 19, beautiful, smart as a whip. She went into town one day to do some shopping, and she never came home. We searched for weeks, got the law involved, but there was nothing. She just vanished. Meredith felt something tighten in her chest. She kept her eyes on the horizon, but she was listening with every fiber of her being. 2 years later, I was in San Francisco on cattle business, and I saw her. She was being led out of a building by a man with a chain, and she looked exactly like you looked on that platform today. Empty. untrained, broken. I tried to get to her, but the man saw me coming and they disappeared into the crowd. I searched that whole damn city for 3 days, but I never found her again. Never found out what happened to her. His voice cracked slightly. So when I saw you up there today with that same look in your eyes, I knew I had to get you out. Had to try to give you what I couldn't give Sarah, a chance. That's all. Just a chance. The ache in Meredith's chest intensified, grew teeth and claws. She didn't want to feel this. Didn't want to let his story matter. Didn't want to care about his lost sister or his sad eyes or the gentleness in his voice. Feeling was dangerous. Feeling led to disappointment, and disappointment led to pain. Better to stay numb, stay empty, stay safe behind the walls they'd built in her mind. But the walls were cracking, just tiny fissures, hairline fractures, but they were there. She could feel them spreading with every soft word he spoke, every moment he didn't hurt her, every second that passed in this impossible place where she had a room with a lock and food at the table, and a man who looked at her like she was human. "You don't have to say anything," Cole said after the silence had stretched long. "I just wanted you to know. Wanted you to understand that I see you, Meredith. I see the person you are under all that training, and I'm going to do everything I can to help you find her again if that's what you want. No pressure, no expectations, just patience and time and whatever you need." He pushed off from the railing then and headed toward the door. "I'm going to turn in early. Been a long day. Make yourself at home, and I'll see you in the morning." He paused at the threshold. "And Meredith, thank you for that stew. It was the best meal I've had in months." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and Meredith was alone with the sunset and the land and the impossible weight of hope trying to take root in the scorched earth of her heart. She stayed on the porch until full dark, watching stars emerge one by one in the vast bowl of sky above the ranch. When the cold finally drove her inside, she checked that Cole's bedroom door was closed, then slipped into her own room. The key was still on the dresser where he'd left it. She stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up with trembling fingers and locked the door from the inside. The click of the mechanism engaging sounded like a promise, like a prayer, like the first word of a language she'd forgotten how to speak. She lay down on the bed fully clothed, unable to bring herself to undress even in privacy, and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion dragged her down into uneasy sleep. She woke before dawn out of long habit, her body conditioned to rise early and start work. For a confused moment, she didn't remember where she was, and panic flared bright and hot in her chest. Then, memory returned. The ranch. Cole. The room with a lock. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff from sleeping in her clothes, and listened to the sounds of the house coming alive around her. Footsteps in the main room. The clank of the stove being stoked. Low humming. Tuneless but content. Cole was awake and moving around. She unlocked her door and emerged cautiously, found him building up the fire for breakfast. He glanced up and gave her a small smile. "Morning. Hope I didn't wake you with all the noise." She shook her head and moved toward the kitchen, ready to take over. This she could do. This was familiar ground. But Cole stepped back from the stove and gestured to it. "All yours if you want it. I was just going to make coffee and fry some eggs, but I'm betting you can do better." She could. She made coffee strong and hot, fried eggs and salt pork, made pan biscuits that were light and fluffy. Cole ate with obvious appreciation, thanked her again, and then explained the day's work while he finished his coffee. "I need to ride out and check the fence line in the north pasture. There's been some problems with coyotes, and I want to make sure they haven't dug under anywhere. I'll probably be gone most of the day." He glanced at her. "You all right here on your own? There's plenty to do if you want to keep busy. The house could use a good cleaning. There's mending in the basket by the fireplace. The garden's out back if you want to see what's there. But you don't have to do everything at once. Pace yourself." Pace yourself. Like she had control over her own time, her own effort, like she was allowed to make those decisions, After he left, she stood in the silent house and felt the weight of choice pressing down on her. She could clean. She could mend. She could work in the garden. She could do nothing at all. The freedom was terrifying, paralyzing, more frightening than any direct order had ever been. In the end, she cleaned because that's what she knew, because work made sense when nothing else did. She scrubbed floors and washed windows and beat rugs until the house gleamed. She found the mending basket and repaired every torn seam, every missing button. By the time the sun was lowering toward the horizon and she heard hoofbeats approaching, she'd transformed the house from bachelor quarters to a genuine home. Cole came in dusty and tired, pulled up short when he saw the difference. "My God," he said softly, looking around. "This place hasn't been this clean since I moved in. You've been working all day." She waited for him to be pleased, to praise her, to confirm that she'd done right. Instead, he looked almost worried. "I didn't mean for you to wear yourself out. I meant what I said about pacing yourself." He moved closer, studying her face. "When's the last time you took a break? Had water? Sat down?" She didn't know, hadn't thought about it. You worked until the work was done or until you were told to stop. Those were the rules. Cole sighed and gently steered her toward a chair. "Sit. I'll make us some coffee and then we'll figure out supper together. And tomorrow, I want you to stop every few hours and rest. You hear me? Working yourself to exhaustion isn't going to earn you anything here except me being concerned." That night fell into a pattern similar to the first. She cooked. They ate together. She sat on the porch while he cleaned up. He joined her after, kept a respectful distance, talked about the ranch and the land and his plans for the future. He never asked her questions directly, never pushed her to respond, just offered his words into the space between them like gifts she could accept or ignore as she chose. Days became a week, then 2. The pattern held. Cole worked the ranch, treating her with unfailing gentleness and respect. She cooked and cleaned and slowly, carefully, began to believe that maybe he meant what he said. Maybe he really wasn't going to hurt her. Maybe this wasn't an elaborate game designed to break her even more thoroughly. The changes started small. One morning she took her coffee out to the porch before starting her work. Just stood there for 10 minutes watching the sunrise. Cole saw her through the window and smiled but didn't comment. Didn't punish her for the stolen time. The next day, she did it again. She started leaving her door unlocked at night, though she couldn't have said why. Started speaking occasionally, just single words at first. Yes, when he asked if she wanted more coffee. Thank you when he complimented her cooking. Her voice was rusty from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but Cole's whole face lit up the first time she spoke to him directly. 3 weeks in, he brought up the collar. They were on the porch in the evening, and he'd been quieter than usual all day. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about that collar," he said carefully. "It's got to be uncomfortable. I'd like to get it off you if you're willing. I know a blacksmith in town who's discreet, wouldn't ask questions. We could go in tomorrow, have him cut it off, but only if you want to. I won't push." Meredith's hand flew to her throat, touching the iron band that had become so familiar she almost forgot it was there. Almost. Having it removed meant being visible in a different way, meant losing the one clear sign that she was owned and therefore under someone's protection, however twisted. Without it, she'd be vulnerable in new ways. But with it, she'd never be free of what they'd made her. She looked at Cole, really looked at him for maybe the first time, saw the hope in his eyes, the careful patience, the genuine desire to help without any expectation of reward. He'd kept every promise he'd made, had given her space and safety and time, had asked for nothing beyond the basic household work, and had treated her like a person instead of property every single day. "Yes," she whispered, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff, like stepping into an abyss, like the most terrifying thing she'd ever said. "Please." The ride into Nevada City the next morning was tense. Meredith sat rigid beside Cole on the wagon seat, hyper-aware of every person they passed, every stare that caught on her collar. She knew what they were thinking, knew what she represented to them. The knowledge made her want to crawl out of her skin, made her want to disappear entirely. Cole seemed to sense her distress. "Almost there," he said quietly. "Just a few more minutes." The blacksmith shop was at the edge of town, a large building filled with the smell of hot metal and coal smoke. The smith himself was a huge man with arms like tree trunks and a surprisingly gentle face. He took one look at Meredith's collar and his expression darkened. "I hate these damned things," he said bluntly. "Hate everything they represent. Let me get my tools and we'll have it off you in no time, miss." He had her sit on a stool and carefully positioned her head, explaining everything he was doing before he did it. The cold chisel against the lock mechanism. The careful taps of his hammer, precise and controlled. The tension as metal began to give way. It took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Then there was a sharp crack, and the collar fell away in 2 pieces, clattering to the floor like broken chains. Meredith's hands flew to her throat, touching bare skin that hadn't seen daylight in 3 years. The calluses were still there, the permanent reminder of what she'd worn, but the weight was gone. The collar was gone. She was unmarked for the first time since she'd been taken. Something broke inside her chest, something that had been holding back a flood. She made a sound that was half sob, half gasp, and tears she hadn't cried in years started pouring down her face. She couldn't stop them, couldn't control them, couldn't do anything but sit there and shake as 3 years of compressed grief and fear and pain came out all at once. Cole was beside her instantly, not touching but close, his voice low and steady. "It's all right. You're all right. Let it out. Let it all out." The blacksmith quietly left them alone, and Meredith cried until she had nothing left, until she was empty and raw and exhausted. When the storm finally passed, Cole offered her his bandana and she took it, wiped her face, tried to gather herself back into some semblance of control. "I am sorry," she managed, her voice hoarse and broken. "I did not mean to." "Don't apologize," Cole said firmly. "Don't ever apologize for feeling things. That's what makes you human, Meredith. That's what they tried to take from you, and you're getting it back. That's something to celebrate, not apologize for." They paid the blacksmith, who refused to take Cole's money at first and only accepted it when Cole insisted. The ride back to the ranch was quieter, but it was a different kind of quiet. Meredith kept touching her throat, kept feeling the absence of the collar, kept marveling at the strange lightness of existing without that constant pressure. Something had shifted. She could feel it happening inside her, like ice beginning to thaw after a brutal winter. It hurt, this thawing. It was uncomfortable and frightening, and she didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in 3 years, she wanted to find out. Over the following weeks, the changes accelerated. She started talking more, asking questions about the ranch, offering opinions on small things. Cole encouraged every tiny step, never pushing, but always responding with genuine interest when she engaged. He taught her to ride his gentler horse, a patient mare named Daisy, and they started taking evening rides together through the property. He showed her the boundaries of his land, the best places to find wild berries, the creek where trout jumped in the late afternoon. She started to remember what it felt like to be Meredith Owens, not just the broken thing they'd created. Started to remember that she'd liked reading before, and Cole gave her free access to his small library. Started to remember that she'd once had dreams, ambitions, a future she'd imagined for herself before everything went dark, and she started to notice Cole in new ways. Notice the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Notice how he was always careful with the animals, firm but never cruel. Notice how he sang badly while he worked and how he couldn't cook worth a damn, but always tried to help anyway. Notice the strength in his hands and the gentleness in his touch when he'd helped her down from the wagon or passed her something across the table. She noticed, and it terrified her. Because noticing led to feeling, and feeling led to wanting, and wanting led to disappointment. That's what she'd learned. That's what they'd taught her. But here, in this place with this man, maybe the old rules didn't apply. Maybe there were new rules, better rules. Rules that allowed for things like hope and trust and the terrifying possibility of more. It was early November, nearly 2 months since Cole had bought her, when everything changed again. They were in the barn together, she handing him tools while he repaired a broken stall door, working in comfortable silence. It had rained that morning and the air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and hay. "Can I ask you something?" Meredith said suddenly, surprising herself with the question. Cole looked up from his work, gave her his full attention. "Of course. Anything." "Why are you really doing this?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I understand about your sister, and I'm sorry for your loss, but you have spent so much money, so much time, and you ask for nothing in return. I do not understand. What do you want from me?" Cole set down his hammer slowly, his expression serious. "I want you to be free," he said simply. "I want you to have choices, to have a life that's yours. I want you to wake up in the morning and decide what you want to do, not what someone's forced you to do. That's all I've ever wanted." "But why?" she pressed, needing to understand. "Why does that matter to you? I am nothing. I was property, trained livestock. Why do you care?" "Because you're not nothing." Cole's voice was fierce now, intense in a way she'd never heard before. "You're not property or livestock or any of those words. You're a person, a good, strong, brave person who survived things that would have destroyed most people. And you deserve better than what you got. You deserve kindness and respect and the chance to figure out who you are when nobody's trying to break you." Meredith felt tears threatening again. "I do not know if I can be fixed. I do not know if I can ever be normal again." "You don't need to be fixed, do ya?" Cole said, and he moved closer, still careful not to touch, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You need to heal, and that's different. Healing isn't about going back to who you were before. It's about becoming someone new, someone stronger. And you're already doing it, Meredith. Every day I see you getting braver, more yourself. It's the most amazing thing I've ever witnessed." She looked up at him, at this man who'd given her everything and asked for nothing, and felt something click into place in her chest, something warm and bright and absolutely terrifying. "I think I'm starting to care about you," she whispered, "and that frightens me more than anything else." Cole's expression softened, transformed into something so tender it made her chest ache. "I've been caring about you since the day I saw you on that platform," he admitted. "Probably before I should have, probably more than I meant to, but I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want you to feel pressured, didn't want you to think that's why I brought you here." "Is it why you brought me here?" She had to know, had to hear him say it. "No. I brought you here to save you, same as I do for any person in that situation, but I kept you here, in my house, instead of setting you up somewhere else in town because I'm selfish, because I wanted the chance to know you, because from that first moment I saw something in your eyes that called to something in me." He paused, swallowed hard. "But I need you to understand something. You don't owe me anything, not gratitude, not affection, not your time or your presence or anything else. If what you're feeling is just because I've been decent to you, just because I'm the first person in years who hasn't hurt you, then that's not real, and I don't want it." Meredith considered his words carefully, examined her own heart with the tentative curiosity of someone learning to trust their own feelings again. Was this just gratitude? Just relief at being treated like a human being? She didn't think so. What she felt when she looked at Cole was more complex, more textured. It was admiration for his patience, respect for his integrity, attraction to his strength and kindness. It was the way her heart lifted when she heard his voice, the way she'd started thinking about him during the day when they were apart, the way she wanted to know everything about him. "I do not think it is just gratitude," she said slowly. I think it is more. I think I want it to be more. But I do not know how to do this. They trained so much out of me, including how to be close to someone without fear. Cole reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and gently took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip careful and respectful. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said. "No rush, no pressure. We'll take it as slow as you need, and we'll stop any time you want to stop. But if you're willing to try, I'd really like to see where this goes." She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers curled gently around hers, and felt that terrifying warmth in her chest expand. "I am willing to try," she whispered. The trying was harder than she'd expected, but not in the way she'd feared. Cole kept his word about taking things slowly, about respecting her boundaries, but learning to accept affection without flinching, learning to believe that touch could be gentle instead of violent, learning to let him close without every muscle in her body tensing for the inevitable betrayal was a process that required constant effort and trust. He never pushed. When he reached for her hand and she pulled away, he just smiled sadly and tried again later. When she agreed to sit next to him on the porch and then panicked at the closeness, he moved away without complaint and told her it was fine, they could work up to it. When she let him kiss her cheek and then spent the next hour shaking from the intensity of the emotion, he just held her while she cried and promised her that everything was going to be all right. By December, she could hold his hand without fear. By January, she could sit beside him with their shoulders touching and feel safe instead of threatened. By February, she'd kissed him properly for the first time, a soft, tentative press of lips that sent heat flooding through her entire body and made her understand finally the difference between connection and violation. "I love you," Cole told her one evening in early March as they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I know that might be too much too soon, but I need you to know. I love who you are, who you're becoming. I love your strength and your courage. I love the way you sing to yourself when you're working in the garden. I love how you always make sure the horses get treats when you think I'm not looking. I just love you." Meredith turned to him, this man who'd unraveled 3 years of conditioning with nothing but patience and kindness, and felt the last of her walls crumble into dust. "I love you too," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "You gave me back my life, Cole. You gave me back myself." "You did that," he corrected gently. "I just gave you a safe place to do it. Everything else, all that healing and growing, that was all you, Meredith." That night she came to his room for the first time, knocked softly on his door, and asked if she could stay with him. He let her in without question, held her through the night with patient tenderness, let her set every boundary and respected each one without complaint. And when dawn came, and she was still there, still safe, still whole, she knew she'd finally found the home she'd been searching for since the day they took everything from her. They were married in April in a simple ceremony at the small church in Nevada City, with the blacksmith and his wife as witnesses. Meredith wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Cole had bought her in Sacramento, simple blue cotton that matched her eyes. She stood beside him in front of the minister and spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, promising to love and honor this man who'd shown her what those words truly meant. The ranch became theirs instead of his, and she threw herself into making it thrive. She expanded the garden, learned to help with the cattle when extra hands were needed, took over the bookkeeping because she had a better head for numbers. Cole treated her as a full partner in every decision, valued her opinions, celebrated her victories, and supported her through the occasional setback. The nightmares still came sometimes, memories of the years she'd spent under their control. But Cole would wake when she cried out, would hold her, and remind her that she was safe now, that nobody would ever hurt her like that again. And gradually, the nightmares came less frequently, replaced by dreams of the future they were building together. By summer, she was pregnant. The realization was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. She'd never imagined being a mother, never let herself dream that far into a future that seemed impossible. But Cole was overjoyed, treated her like she was made of spun glass even though she insisted she could still work and contribute. They spent evenings talking about names and making plans, transforming one of the unused rooms into a nursery. Their son was born in February of 1874, a healthy boy with his father's green-brown eyes and his mother's determined chin. They named him Thomas after Cole's father, and Meredith held him in her arms and wept with joy because this was hers, truly hers, a life she'd created out of love instead of violence. She looked at Cole across the room and saw her own wonder reflected in his face, saw the future stretching out before them bright with possibility. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic child who loved the ranch and the animals and his parents with equal fervor. When he was 2, Meredith became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah after the sister Cole had lost. The name was both a memorial and a promise, a way of honoring the past while building a better future. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and hard work and deep contentment. The ranch prospered under their joint management, growing from 200 head of cattle to over 500, from a simple house to a proper ranch complex with a bunkhouse for the hands they eventually needed to hire. Meredith became known in the area as a shrewd businesswoman, respected for her intelligence and fair dealing. The broken girl she'd been on that auction platform faded into memory, replaced by a woman who knew her worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. She and Cole added 2 more children to their family, another son named James and a daughter called Elizabeth. Each birth was easier than the last, not because the physical process changed, but because her certainty in her own strength and her right to joy grew with each passing year. She raised her children to be kind but fierce, taught them that every person deserved respect and dignity, made sure they understood the difference between strength and cruelty. On their 10th anniversary, Cole took her back to Nevada City, to the spot where he'd bought her from that auction platform. It was the first time she'd been back since the day they'd removed her collar. "I wanted you to see it from here," he said, standing with his arm around her waist. "Wanted you to remember where you started and see how far you've come." Meredith looked at the platform, now being used to auction cattle instead of people, and felt nothing but a distant pity for the girl she'd been. "I am not her anymore," she said softly. "That girl died the day they put the collar on her, but someone new was born the day you took it off, and I like who she became." "I love who she became," Cole corrected, pulling her closer. "Every day for the rest of my life. I'm going to be grateful I walked into town that day, grateful I had the money to buy you, grateful you gave me the chance to prove I was different." She turned in his arms and kissed him, deep and sure, the kiss of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. "You did not just prove you were different," she told him when they finally pulled apart. "You proved that patience and kindness can undo even the worst damage. You untrained me from their cruelty and taught me how to be human again. That is not something I will ever forget or take for granted." They stayed in town that night at the hotel, a rare luxury. In the morning, they bought supplies and headed back to the ranch, back to the life they'd built from ashes and determination. Their children ran out to meet them when they arrived, and Meredith scooped up little Elizabeth while Cole grabbed Thomas and James, everyone talking at once about what had happened while they were gone. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Meredith and Cole sat on the porch as they'd done countless times before. The stars were brilliant overhead, the air cool with the promise of autumn. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Cole asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "For seeing me when I could not see myself, for waiting when anyone else would have given up, for loving me enough to let me heal at my own pace." She paused, then added, "For giving me a life worth living." "You gave yourself that life," Cole said, but his voice was rough with emotion. "I just held the door open. You're the one who was brave enough to walk through it." Maybe they were both right. Maybe it had taken both of them, her courage and his patience, to undo what had been done to her. Maybe that's what love was supposed to be, two people helping each other become the best versions of themselves, supporting each other through the darkness until they found their way back to the light. Meredith thought about the girl she'd been before they'd taken her, full of dreams and hope. She thought about the broken thing they'd made her into, empty and obedient and barely alive. And she thought about the woman she was now, scarred but whole, damaged but healing, stronger for having survived and fought her way back to herself. All three were part of her story. All three had shaped who she'd become. But this was the chapter that mattered most. This life with Cole, these children they were raising, this ranch they'd built together, this was the proof that cruelty didn't have to win, that kindness could triumph over violence, that patience could undo even the most careful training. This was the evidence that love, real love built on respect and trust and genuine care, could heal wounds that seemed unhealable. Years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. Thomas grew tall and serious, eventually taking over more of the ranch operations. Sarah became a teacher, fierce and compassionate in equal measure. James inherited his mother's head for business and helped expand their operations into new territories. Elizabeth, the youngest, had her father's gentle heart and became known throughout the county for her work with horses. Meredith and Cole grew older together, their hair graying, their movements slowing, but their love never diminishing. They sat on that same porch every evening, holding hands and watching sunsets, talking about their grandchildren and reminiscing about the years they'd shared. The ranch passed to their children but remained the heart of the family, the place where everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations. On a warm evening in June 1903, nearly 31 years after that auction platform in Nevada City, Meredith sat in her rocking chair on the porch and watched her grandchildren playing in the yard. Cole was beside her as always, his hand wrapped around hers, both of them content in the comfortable silence of people who'd spent a lifetime learning each other's rhythms. "Do you ever regret it?" Cole asked suddenly. "Choosing this life? Choosing me?" Meredith looked at him, this man who'd saved her in every way a person could be saved, and smiled. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me everything, Cole. You gave me freedom and safety and love. You gave me children and a home and a future I never thought I would have. How could I possibly regret the best decision I ever made?" "I think I got the better end of that deal," Cole said, raising her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "You made me better, Meredith. You taught me what real strength looks like, what courage means. Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." She leaned over and kissed him softly, tasting the years and the love and the shared history that bound them together more surely than any legal document or spoken vow. When she pulled back, she rested her forehead against his and whispered, "Thank you for having the patience to untrain me. Thank you for teaching me that I was worth more than what they made me believe. Thank you for loving me even when I could not love myself." "Always your," Cole promised. And it was the same promise he'd been making for 3 decades, the same promise he'd keep until his last breath. "Always and forever, Meredith. That's how long I'll love you." They sat together as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built from nothing but hope and determination. 4 children, 12 grandchildren, a thriving ranch, and a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for the testing. It was a good life, Meredith thought. A life worth fighting for, worth healing for, worth every painful step of the journey from that platform to this porch. They'd taken the broken pieces of who she'd been and built something beautiful from the wreckage. And though the scars would always remain reminders of what she'd survived, they were proof of her strength rather than symbols of her defeat. As darkness settled over the ranch and the stars began their nightly dance overhead, Meredith squeezed Cole's hand and smiled. She was free. She was loved. She was home. and that was everything she'd never dared to dream she could have. The years had proved what she'd been too damaged to believe on that September day in 1872, that patience could triumph over cruelty, that love could heal the deepest wounds, and that every person, no matter how broken, deserved the chance to become whole again. Cole had given her that chance, and she'd seized it with both hands and built a life that honored both the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.